Okay, good afternoon. Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I am Feng Shenghu, the Richard G. Engelsman Dean of Arts and Sciences. And it is an honor to welcome you to the installation of Jeffrey M. Zacks as the Edgar James Swift Professor in Arts and Sciences. It's so wonderful to see all of you here, so many colleagues and members of our WashU community. I would also like to welcome everyone joining us via our live stream. I wave at you. Thank you for helping mark this special occasion. We are especially delighted to have some of Jeff's family members in the audience, and they include his father, Jim Zacks, his mother, Rose Zacks, and I understand they are very famous cognitive psychologists. And Jeff's wife, Leslie Zacks, his daughter, Didia, his son, Jonah, and I can proudly tell you that Didia and Jonah are students in arts and sciences, so we can claim them, that we share them with their parents and grandparents. And I actually happen to know Jonah pretty well. So would Jeff's guests please stand to be recognized? Up. As many of you know, installation ceremonies are among my favorite campus traditions. They allow us to come together as a campus community to recognize the generosity of our donors and to celebrate the achievements of our outstanding faculty. These special gatherings also offer us a chance to pause our busy schedules and appreciate the exciting progress we're making toward establishing arts and sciences as a global model for research, scholarship, and education. This ambitious vision, which we call the Decade of Arts and Sciences, calls for collaboration and innovation of our most visionary scholars. As professor and chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, Jeff Zacks embodies the values of convergence, creativity, and cutting-edge scholarship that has become a hallmark of arts and sciences at WashU. After earning his bachelor's degree from Yale and his PhD from Stanford, otherwise known as the WashU of the East Coast and the WashU of the West Coast, Jeff joined WashU in 1999 as an assistant professor in psychology. A few years later, he added the title of assistant professor of radiology to his CV. Under his leadership, the dynamic cognition laboratory here at WashU explores how we understand events, navigate our everyday lives, and process film and media. Jeff is especially interested in how cognition changes in brains that are developing, aging, and disordered. To pursue his research questions, his lab uses behavior tasks, eye tracking, neuroimaging, and computational modeling. This innovative research has been funded by federal agencies and private foundations, including the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Office of Naval Research, and the James S. McDonald Foundation. A prolific author, Jeff has written 3 books, published more than 110 journal articles, and written for popular audience in Salon, Eon, and the New York Times. This impressive set of academic achievements has made Jeff a highly respected leader in his field. Among his numerous accolades, he is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And in just a few minutes, you're going to hear more about Jeff's outstanding career from Vice Dean and Professor Deanna Barge. And for now, I would like to turn our attention to the namesake of this professorship and the gift that made it possible. This professorship honors Edgar James Swift, the inaugural chair of the Department of Psychology in Arts and Sciences. Born in Ohio in 1860, Professor Swift received his bachelor's degree from Amherst College in 1886. He then traveled to Europe and studied with several German psychologists before returning to the United States to teach and write. In 1900, he began graduate study at Clark University in Massachusetts, earning his doctorate in 1903. Professor Swift joined the WashU faculty that same year, and he served as chair of the Department of Psychology and Education in one single department, the Department of Psychology and Education. And I thought I was the only one who didn't know. Turns out that quite a few people didn't know. Until 1924, when psychology and education were separated into two departments. And he served as the chair of the Department of Psychology until his retirement. The author of 7 books and 84 articles, Professor Swift wrote for practitioners in his field as well as the general public. Funding for the Swift Professorship was provided through the Kate M. Gregg Faculty Development Fund, which was established in 2001 by a generous bequest from a WashU alumna. We are grateful for their generosity and for the legacy of Edgar James Swift, which continues to help us recruit and retain the world's most talented scholars, such as Jeff Zacks. And now I would like to invite Deanna Barch, the Gregory B. Couch Professor of Psychiatry, to the podium to share more about Jeff's outstanding career.
Thank you, Dean Hugh. So it is really my great pleasure and joy to say more about Jeff, his career, his life, his family. I have known Jeff since 1999 when he joined us as a fresh assistant professor right after the year I became a fresh assistant professor. And Todd Braber, who's in the audience, who's my lab mate and spouse, were reminiscing that Jeff actually sat on the committee that interviewed Todd when he was applying at the WashU of the West. and Todd was on the search committee that hired Jeff at the one and only WashU of the Midwest. And it's really been an immense joy to have Jeff as a colleague for all of these years. Dean Hugh already, indicated that he came to us straight after completing his PhD at Stanford and his BA in cognitive science at Yale. And Dean Hugh already alluded to the fact that he comes from a family of famous cognitive psychologists, both of whom are here, Jim and Rose, who are really well-known scholars in their own right. But I think it is truly not hyperbole to say that Jeff is the world's foremost scholar in the study of event cognition. Our understanding of how we develop, maintain, update models of our world and the events that we experience, the neural systems that support those representations, and how our cognition about these events change as we age and what implications that has for our functioning. He has studied this in so many different and creative ways, right? Computational modeling, behavioral tasks, neuroimaging, different populations, right? Eye tracking, virtual reality, so many different and creative things, right? And this has led him to be funded by a variety of external agencies, as already noted, but also have led him to really win wonderful awards in the field that acknowledge, his work. The McGowan Young Investigator Prize from the American Psychological Foundation, the Psychonomic Society Mid-Career Awards, right? These are some of the highest honors in our field. He's really published many books, articles, all of that. But I think what people may not know about Jeff is that to focus on event cognition really misses the totality of who Jeff is as a scholar. He really epitomizes the modern day Renaissance person, I'm going to say person, Jeff is the only person I know whose work really truly spans all of the disciplines in arts and sciences. He collaborates with biologists, neuroscientists, engineers, artists, film and media, philosophers, architects, right? Truly, truly transdisciplinary. He has done some of the foremost work in the cognitive neuroscience of film, right? Which really has allowed him to kind of cross different disciplines. It's allowed him to blend his work with colleagues in other departments. It's led to wonderful classes on the cognitive neuroscience of film that are highly popular, and it's frankly led to much attention in the media, right? And he was doing transdisciplinary work before transdisciplinary work was a buzzword, right? And truly, very few of us do that these days, right? Many of us, we might cross over to the department next door, maybe down the quad a little bit. But Jeff is really, truly one of those rare people who I think really understands disciplines across those boundaries in a really deep and meaningful way, respects, what different disciplines bring to the table, and is able to bring together collaborations that otherwise wouldn't be possible. It is this work, this really transdisciplinary work, that I think led him to be elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, right, which is one of the oldest learned societies in the United States that values contributions across the arts and humanities and sciences. And, Jeff really epitomizes, right, that full range of things that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences values. Now, if what I described was all that Jeff had done in his career, it would still fully merit him receiving this endowed chair. But I think everybody who knows Jeff knows that his contributions to service and leadership in the department, the university, and the field are legendary. He is always the first one to raise his hand when something needs to be done. He currently serves as chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, but he also served as associate chair for 8 years previous to that. He served on most major and led most major committees at the university. He's also served on the governing board of the Psychonomic Society, which is probably one of the, if not the most foremost society in his area. And perhaps most importantly, this might be his most important job to date, he currently serves as president of the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Truly a work and a labor of love, because this is the federation that is bringing together all of our behavioral science societies to advocate for the needs of science, right? Something that is incredibly important, particularly today. There's a much longer list of leadership roles that he's played, including leading multiple T32 training grants, another labor of love, and numerous other society governing roles. Now above, I said, well, Jeff's a modern day Renaissance person in terms of his scholarship. But again, if you know Jeff, I would be remiss not to mention all the other areas in which he is a Renaissance person, from playing the saxophone in a band with other members of the psych department and members of the med school, being a great chef and a prolific baker. You should talk to him about all the gear he has in his kitchen and his oven. Gardening, ice fishing, biking, running, just a host of things. Sometimes I think there's nothing Jeff can't do. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that success like Jeff's is always a team effort. His wonderful spouse, Leslie, and his 2 children, Jonah and Delia, are his biggest supporters and forces of nature in their own rights. Anyone who has read any of Leslie's writing in Medium knows her intellect and humor well. And some of you, maybe many of you in the audience, have met Jonah and Delia in your classes here at WashU, both of who are brilliant and wonderful young people in their own right. In sum, I think we are beyond fortunate to have Jeff as a colleague and now our departmental and a field leader at a time when we so need this. He is incredibly deserving of this endowed chair and really is just hitting his peak as a scholar, leader, and a significant force in the field of psychological and brain sciences.
Jeff, I present you with this beautiful medallion. It's a symbol of your new prestigious appointment. The front reads, Edgar James Swift Professor in Arts and Sciences, Washington University in St. Louis. Engraved in the back it says Jeffrey M. Zacks, February 4th, 2025. And so here it comes.
Never done this before.
And so, the new tradition in arts and sciences is this is going to be on 24/7, and the only people who can help him if it gets too heavy are Jonah and Didier. And I can order them to help, right? Because I'm the dean, so. But congratulations again. So it's over here. Stay.
I'll open and close today with thanks. First, thank you to Dean Hu and to Deanna for those exceptionally kind words. To the assembled guests, I offer thanks commingled with apologies because I'm surely not going to live up to the expectations set by their remarks. There are so many of you here who've collaborated with me, befriended me, and supported me in my time at WashU, and I thank you. I particularly want to recognize those who've traveled significant distances to be here. We're honored to be in the presence of 5 amazing Dynamic Cognition Laboratory alumni, Dr. Michelle Eisenberg of Peninsula Behavioral Health in Palo Alto, Professor Christopher Kirby, Chair-elect of the Department of Psychology at Grand Valley State University, Professor Lauren Richmond of Stony Brook University, Dr. Nicole Spear of the Institute for Cognitive Science at the University of Colorado, and Dr. Alfred Yu of the Army Research Lab. We also have an amazing contingent of current lab members all the way from Summers Hall. I'm grateful to be joined by my family, my parents, Jim and Rose Zacks, as noted previously, who came from Michigan, my parents-in-law, Fred and Marion Kleinberg, who came from Minnesota, my brother from another mother, Dan Velliser, who came from Kansas City, and my nuclear family, Delia, Jonah, and Leslie, who came from, respectively, the South 40, the Loop, and Ames Place. There's an old saw that says that it takes a village to raise a child, and really, a mid-career academic is basically a child, and so it takes a village, it turns out, to raise one of us as well. I'd like to say just a little bit more about my academic extended childhood because I've been incredibly lucky in my mentors. Academics like to trace their intellectual genealogies, and according to the one on NeuroTree, I have 3 parents, which is interesting. Michael Tarr was my primary undergraduate advisor in his role running the cognitive science program at Yale when I was an undergraduate. And Mike helped me navigate the fuzzy boundaries between psychology, computer science, and philosophy. The late Tom Landauer hired me at Bell Communications Research and inspired me with a keen understanding of how apparently abstruse phenomena in cognitive science sit really at the core of our everyday experience with media and technology. Barbara Tversky inspired, supported, and mentored and shaped me as she patiently mentored me through my PhD in graduate school. I was also lucky to be mentored by other inspirational cognitive scientists and neuroscientists, including the late Dave Rumelhart, the late Gordon Bauer, Herb Clark, and John Gabrielli. When I arrived at WashU straight from my PhD and green as spring, I would have been sunk without the guidance of Chair Roddy Roediger, who hired me, as well as Associate Chair Dave Belota. And as Deanna mentioned, she and Todd and our colleague Randy Buckner, who chaired that search committee that hired me, Before I leave off thanking my parents, I just want to return and I thank Dean Hu and Deanna for setting this up so nicely. I want to return to my biological parents because they are also my scientific parents. I'm proud to be a second-generation academic, a proud second-generation cognitive scientist, and their willingness to talk shop with me at each stage has enriched my experience tremendously. Okay, I want to turn from gratitude now to history. Your program has a few words about Edgar James Swift, and Dean Hu nicely summarized those, and I want to expand on those a little bit. And I want to thank, in particular, my predecessor in this chair, Tom Oltmans, and also the WashU archives to whom I turn for material. I hope this will help situate the work that we do today in the department that he founded and in the lab. Edgar James Swift, as was noted, was born in Ravenna, Ohio, and attended Amherst College, earning his bachelor's degree in 1886. He spent time studying with two of the great founders of experimental psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, before returning to the US to do his PhD with G. Stanley Hall at Clark. By the way, it turns out that I am descended academically from all three of Swift's mentors. So through Mike Tarr, I am descended from Hermann Ebbinghaus, and through Barbara, I'm descended from Ebbinghaus, and through Mike Tarr, I'm descended from Hall. It turns out I'm also descended from Hall through Tom Landauer, and Hall studied with Wundt, so bingo. After finishing his PhD, Swift was immediately hired by Washington University to join, as we learned, was then the Department of Psychology and Education. Swift's early work was on perceptual motor learning. He had a line of research on juggling. He became interested in the psychology of learning, adolescence, and the workplace, and that work dominated the rest of his career. I've read one of his books carefully and skimmed several of the others. Unsurprisingly, for a white man in a position of power in the early 20th century, he occasionally wrote things that reflected uncritical biases about people he didn't know. But what's striking is that more frequently, he wrote with an understanding and an advocate's eye about people whom his peers generally dismissed, particularly adolescents classified as delinquents. His focus as a theoretician was on the environmental and social factors that determine life outcomes. For example, in his 1908 book, Mind in the Making, he wrote that investigation of the lives of reform school boys almost always leaves the impression that, with possibly a few exceptions, they're quite representative of the average active normal boy, and an investigator usually ends his work with the overwhelming conviction that, after all, probably the only reason why he and his boyhood associates did not graduate from the same sort of institution was the difference in their environment. Dan Velliser, who grew up with me since I was 3 years old, can probably attest that there, but for the grace of a little luck, go both of us. Swift had a nuanced understanding of the interaction between brain development and environmental influences. He wrote that the incomparable difference in mental capacity between a child of 7, when the brain has so nearly reached its maximum size and weight, and the adult indicates corresponding neural changes. Rudimentary cells must develop and become capable of functional activity, and the labyrinthine system of intracellular fibers association paths must be organized. All this requires time, and it is because of its long period of immaturity that the nervous system is so sensitive to the environment. This portrait of Swift, which is in your program, is the one that's most often reproduced, and it seems to me a serious and anxious-seeming one. However, there's evidence that he had a well-developed lighter side. He is described in several yearbooks as a popular professor, and in this one, he apparently collaborated with the yearbook staff to poke fun at himself. Most relevant for today's event, as you learned, when psychology and education amicably divorced, Swift became the first chair of the newly independent department. I now serve as the 10th person to hold that position. We renamed ourselves a few years ago to the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. Coming in 9 generations later, I'd like to turn next to the work that we are doing in the laboratory in the department that Swift founded. In this line of work, I'm captivated I'm in this line of work because I'm captivated by the bare bald facts of human experience. People are capable of astonishing feats. And most of us, most of the time, have the sense that our lives are vivid, rich, dynamic, and textured. But we're piles of meat, driven by a slow, squishy central processing unit built out of noisy, unreliable neurons and glia. What are the computational, physiological, and social mechanisms that give rise to these phenomena? In the lab, we're getting at this using a range of methods that include measuring behavior, measuring brain activity, stimulating the brain, and building computational models of cognitive systems. We're interested in human experience in general and in how it changes as a function of development, differences in experience, and in disease and injury. The through line here is studying the complexity of our mundane, everyday worlds. One important question about everyday experience is, how do we keep track of all this stuff? I want you to try a little exercise. Just close your eyes for a sec. Go ahead. And point to me with your eyes closed. Okay. Now point to the buffet. Okay, you can open your eyes now. You did great, by the way. And the thing is, I could keep naming objects, and I could probably come up with a few dozen that you could point to quite reliably, despite the fact that you weren't trying to track those objects. Even more impressive, you could imagine what would happen, what the world would be like if the objects were to move, or if you were to move. And this is incredibly important for planning your actions. So let me give you an example from an old experiment we did with Jeff Ogeman and Frank Gilliam when they were on the faculty here in neurosurgery and neurology. They were working with patients with intractable epilepsy. And as part of the pre-surgical planning, they implant grids of electrodes. And during that period, when they're in the hospital, they're often eager to participate in research. So we asked the patients to perform a few spatial reasoning tasks, one of which is illustrated here. If you try to judge whether the two figures are identical or mirror images, you might have the sense that you're mentally rotating the bottom figure until it's lined up with the top figure. Whereas if I just change the picture slightly, delete the top, and ask you, is the remaining figure left-handed or right-handed, you might have the sense that instead you were imagining yourself in the position of the figure. And it turns out there's a lot of evidence that corresponds with those intuitions. And we can model this computationally, we can study it behaviorally, but we can also study it in these patients. So this is an electrode grid from one of the patients, and these lines are illustrating the connections across which we stimulated. And it turned out that there was one focal spot in the right parietal lobe that when we stimulated this area, it completely knocked out, reduced to chance his ability to do the first of those tasks while having no effect on the second. And those data and others strongly suggest that the brain has specialized computational mechanisms and neural mechanisms for updating the imagined location and orientation of objects, and different mechanisms for updating the imagined location and orientation of our own bodies. Thinking about how we understand our spatial environment leads naturally to asking how we use spatial representations to think about other things and communicate and to solve problems. One really cool platform for thinking about how we use spatial representations is data graphics. And the role of data graphics in our lives became super salient for me in the early phase of COVID, when we were seeing many depictions of numbers and case numbers and reproduction statistics. And folks seem to have a very hard time translating these into personal or public policy. Part of the problem is that our visual systems are optimized for identifying and tracking objects, and so they have some biases that can lead to perceptual distortions. For example, consider these two curves, both showing exponential growth like we saw in the early pandemic. If you look at these curves, it seems obvious that the orange is rising faster than the black. However, if I shift them, you can see that they're just displaced versions of each other, right? So the black starts later, but they rise at exactly the same rate. Another part of the problem is that a lot of growth processes that we observe in nature are linear, like a cup filling with water or snow accumulating on a porch. It turns out that exponential growth, of course, as Malthus showed us, is all around us. It's just that exponential growth tends to start really slow and then quickly get super fast. And the rate at which it gets faster is itself getting faster. And so we often miss the critical exponential phases. These are data from 2020 showing COVID cases in Turkey at the beginning of the pandemic, plotted in the way we usually saw at that time. If you were looking at these data through mid-March, you might well think that things were fine, not appreciating that those tiny numbers were poised to blow up. However, if we invert the numbers, which you can think of as plotting the number of healthy people available to take care of each infected person, it might be easier to appreciate the cause for concern. So on March 11th, there was one case with basically a whole nation of healthy people. 10 days later, there was a small city to care for each healthy person. 10 days after that, there was the equivalent of a small town. And seeing that might have made it easier for policymakers to appreciate the challenge. Reasoning about bodies moving or data changing amounts to reasoning about the events of our lives. And a major ongoing focus in the laboratory has been how people understand everyday events, particularly the temporal structure of those events. One piece of phenomenology that I continue to find incredibly striking is that though the inputs to our nervous system are complex, dynamic, and broadband, most of us, most of the time, report that we're experiencing a modest number of coherent events, one after the other. Let me illustrate with a little demonstration, and this illustrates a task that we use all the time in the lab. So I'm going to show you a little video clip, and I want you to clap whenever, in your judgment, one meaningful unit of activity ends and another begins. There's no right or wrong answer. I'm simply interested in your judgments. And in this case, I'll ask you to mark off the smallest units that are natural and meaningful to you. So get your clapping hands ready. Okay, you guys are great. Notice how, with approximately 0 trials of practice, you showed great agreement about where the boundaries are. This turns out to be a broadly replicable phenomena across cultures and age groups. If we record brain activity with functional MRI, or we ask people to watch narrative films, or movies like you saw, or to simply read stories one word at a time, we see large, consistent responses throughout the cortex. Here I'm showing you data from 3 representative studies. The lateral surface of the right hemisphere is on the top, the medial surface on the bottom, and you can see striking consistency in the locations of the evoked responses. If we plot the time courses of those responses, you see that they rise a few seconds before the point that's identified as a boundary, and they peak about 8 seconds later. And that later latency represents the fact that the functional MRI response lags about 8 seconds after the neural activity that causes it. The process of segmenting activity into events turns out to be important for planning and coordinating activity and for forming coherent memories. These data come from a study that Heather Bailey, who regrets that she can't be here, she came down with neurovirus. This is the joy of parenthood. But when Heather was in the lab, she did this really cool study looking at the relationship between how well people segmented activity and how much they remembered later. And they show that individuals who are better, according to this measure of segmentation, remember more. A natural question that arises is whether this relationship is causal, or does it just reflect some third factor that leads people to both segment better and remember better? Shani Flores attacked this question in a series of experiments showing that simply asking people to segment while watching a movie led to better memory that was durable for intervals up to a month. These mechanisms of forming and updating representations, like most of human experience, develop and change across the lifespan. An important theme across these projects in the laboratory has been changes in aging and early stage dementia. If you need any convincing that mechanisms of aging are important, I would invite you to compare the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed graduate student you see in this picture to what you see in front of you now. Lots of things change with age, and some of them are not necessarily things we would have predicted in advance. This graph from a hot-off-the-presses study led by Dr. Maverick Smith, currently a postdoctoral fellow in the lab, who's just today off interviewing for a faculty position, so send him hopes and prayers. It shows the effect of that intervention on memory that I described a couple slides ago. So the blue dot is showing when they're doing that segmentation condition, they're remembering more than when they're just trying to encode, as indicated by the orange dot. And you can see that this is robust in 20-year-olds and holds through 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Oh, wait. In that last group, who are not that old, right, the oldest group in the sample, the effect is completely absent. And we've now replicated this 2 more times. We don't have a fully baked explanation for why it's the case, but it's clearly an important phenomenon. The good news is that there's a different intervention that is effective in older adults. This came from a study that Dr. Dave Gold did when he was a postdoctoral fellow in the lab. And you can see we use this simple movie editing to try to shape people's event segmentation. And when you mark natural event boundaries by pausing the movie and ringing a bell, you find that people remember more of that information. And it's not just that marking anything leads to better memory for the thing that you segment off, because if you put edits in the middle of events, that has no effect. Okay, this simple editing intervention highlights one of the luckiest things about my job. I get to think not only about how people comprehend and remember, but also about how these processes interface with art and technology and health. As an academic, my interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaborations with humanists and artists have been some of my most exciting and the fun of my career. One abiding interest, as Deanna mentioned, has been film. Consider the cut, the point at which 2 runs of the camera are joined together. Here's a scene from The West Wing in which Sam and Josh are having a heated conversation. This 45-second clip has 12 cuts in it, but most of them are pretty invisible. They line up where you would tend to be looking from one location to another if you were there in the scene. But despite your being minimally aware of these cuts, your brain, the visual parts of your brain are highly active at the cuts. So this is brain activity time-locked to cuts. And in particular, there seem to be a set of higher level visual areas, shown here in red, that are feeding back on early vision to bridge across that visual discontinuity to make them less salient to your brain. But here they walk through the door, boom, there's a whole new set of characters. That is another thing. That's an event boundary like we talked about before, and at those moments you see the pattern of activity in the default mode network that I mentioned in the earlier slide. I could think and talk about this stuff all day, just ask my lab mates, family, or friends, but I also get terrific satisfaction from sharing this information. As a teacher, but also writing for disparate readerships and working to do what the president of the American Psychological Association, George Miller, in 1969 described as giving psychology away. As Deanna mentioned, I volunteer with an outfit called the Federation of Associations in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences. We work with federal agencies to help them make use of the best available behavioral science and neuroscience. We advocate for science-based policies, and we advocate for research funding. Speaking plainly, for a few years now, we've been a time of historically low faith in academia, in institutions, and in science. A 2024 Pew Research Center study found that the proportion of Americans expressing great or fair trust in science declined from 87% in 2020 to 73% in 2023. It did rebound up to 76% last year. The last few weeks have seen in these undercurrents erupt into an acute crisis for research across the sciences and humanities, as well as for our public health, public works, and social services. All of us who want to see the fruits of the university brought to bear for the betterment of humankind need to be thinking now about what we as individuals and as organizations can do to preserve the great benefits of our institutions of higher learning and our research infrastructure, our institutions of higher learning and our research infrastructure for the world. I hope that my work with FABs and other organizations will help my students, colleagues, and lab mates enjoy the great good fortune from which I have benefited in my intellectual inquiries. In that vein, I want to wrap up by thanking the federal agencies and private foundations that have funded our work over many years. And again, I've been incredibly lucky in my colleagues, friends, and family, all of you. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. And I mentioned that installation ceremonies are among my favorite traditions. And most definitely, the scholarly presentation is truly the highlight of each event. So, and thank you all for joining us today. And this concludes today's ceremony. There's a reception back there, so please join us.